What's going on, guys? It's Frito here for your Overwatch. Big patch went on to the experimental card, but no wacky changes in terms of formatting. This time, just like the previous one, it looks like they're testing changes that could be coming to the live game. They say as much in the patch notes. This one as well will be in the 2-2-2 format in order to test out how these changes might affect quick play and ranked. And last time they did that, most of the changes went through, except for the most insane ones. Starting out, we have Ashe. Her rifle's magazine size has been increased from 12 to 15. Now she has 3 more shots than before, really increasing her uptime. Here at the bottom, the unscoped shots now can be fired much more quickly after firing a scope shot. That's the massive buff here, because what it means when you're in a quick battle with someone in a duel trying to get a pick off, you now very quickly can scope up, hit a shot, and then spam from the hip to finish that target. This is a huge deal when dueling flankers or picking off supports. This essentially gives her a much faster time to kill combo. Throwing in a dynamite, hitting a shot, and hip firing to finish the target is going to be far more effective than before. But in order to compensate for this buff, they did make it so that the unscoped shots now reach a bigger maximum spread, up to 6. However, that's maximum spread. So that means once you shoot multiple shots, it will spread out wider than it did before. But just testing this on the training bots, it was difficult to replicate this spread feeling like it was going to matter. So the trade-off of these two changes coming through is going to be a buff to skilled players for sure. Because if you don't miss those early follow-up shots with hip fire, well, the spread's not really going to make a difference, because it takes a little bit for you to fire multiple shots for the spread to maximize anyway. Other recovery buffs, you can now start reloading much more quickly after firing a scoped shot. Similar to the other huge recovery buff that allows you to shoot after a scoped shot, you now can reload more quickly too, just reducing downtime. That's good. And this one might be a little bit controversial. The second patch note reads, shots no longer queue up the next shot if pressed slightly before the recovery has finished. If you ever noticed, as you're shooting with Ashe, if you spam your fire button a little bit too early, your next shot is just going to fire out. So there's a bigger window to keep the fire rate going. Now, the downside of that is if you struggle to pace your shots and you needed it to continue firing out when you already have the target, now there's going to be like a dead zone essentially in the timing where you have to wait until the weapon finishes firing before you can get that next shot. So your muscle memory might be affected by this, but it overall is a buff, because really with a little bit of skill and getting used to it, you shouldn't need that anyway. And the downside of how it was before was far more punishing in that if you queued up that next shot ahead of time, but your target moved and you miss, that's a really big deal and a gap in value. So now it'll only come out as you press the trigger, which hopefully will make Ashe a little bit more accurate in terms of pacing her shots. So all things considered, Ashe going up in power level, going to be a much more flexible damage dealer now. Onto the next buff, to Genji. This buff looks really minor on paper, and it is going to be a 0.1 increase on his secondary fire rate. But again, they don't define it as fire rate, they define it as recovery, which is important because recovery means the delay it puts on you until you can do your next action. So this also counts for melee canceling after a secondary fire. So although not as big as the buffs that were to Ashe, this is a speed buff to Genji, both in his damage output, but I think even more importantly, being able to follow up on damage more quickly. It's interesting to think back to sort of the launch window of Overwatch where Genji was one of the best characters, and over time they really slowed him down to remove some of his min-maxing combos, and now with this recovery buff, it's sort of trying to add a little bit of that power back. Next up, big nerf to Mei. Her ammo overall goes down by 80, but she's going to be getting more secondary fire shots in exchange. So whereas before, her old capacity allowed her to shoot 10 times with her secondary fire, she'll now get to fire 12. But more importantly is the limit to how much freeze ray Mei's going to be able to put out before needing to reload. Now, you effectively get, I would say, 2 full freezes without having to reload. And you can see Blizzard really trying to tighten the gap in this sort of play and increase the power level of more FPS type plays in the game with Genji and Ashe getting buffed. In truth, to be honest, I think this might not do much for the highest tiers of play where they're trying to attack Mei, I think, and will just make her worse in ranked. Because when your team is more coordinated, you probably don't need that extra ammo to execute the play of rushing the enemy down, freezing, and focus firing. But in ranked, Mei has already been kind of suffering from the nerfs, in my opinion, where it's more difficult to commit to a fight as a team. But if there's less insta-freeze in the game, will anybody really be upset? I suppose people who don't want to play up against Wrecking Ball might feel that way, but this will be something interesting to watch as it develops. Next buff is to Pharah, where her rocket launcher now does the same amount of damage as it did before when you hit direct hits, but now the explosion is better. This is just a straight buff to Pharah, because remember, back in the day when they reduced her explosion damage, they increased her fire rate to compensate, and we're not seeing that same nerf go down. Now she still has that same fire rate, but exchanges 15 damage away from impact into explosion, which means now you can get 80 damage when your rocket hits the ground close to a target, which means you can 3-shot a target without directing them. Quite a large buff to Pharah. Again, I don't know if it changes the higher tiers of play, but definitely is going to be affecting things for the average ladder player, because Pharah already was a bit troublesome to deal with, just in the nature of how she plays. Now, with her shots being more forgiving, she's going to generate ult faster and as well have a bit more of that Junkrat effect, where just spamming near you is going to be enough to confirm kills, and that's a scary proposition, but at the same time, they are buffing Ashe on the other side. With D.Va still being strong, I don't think Pharah is gonna all of a sudden dominate the highest tiers of play, but for most players, I think this is going to affect them, especially players on console. But if Pharah does come back in a big way, we'll be sure to make more guides on how to counter her. Last nerf for the video, Reinhardt's steadfast knockback resistance has been dropped down to 30. This is where they originally had it, but it's also quite the massive nerf. I think this puts Reinhardt from the best tank in the game easily to I'm not sure. It's gonna depend. Granted, his dominance does require Lucio anyway, and when we've seen hero pools without him, Rein hasn't dominated, which makes balancing this kind of thing a little bit tricky. Keep in mind, at the 50% value for Reinhardt Steadfast, he essentially could never be knocked off a cliff, basically. He'd have to be standing right next to it to get booped off. At the 30% value, though, the window of crowd control actually being able to have an effect now gets opened a bit, especially when you combo multiple CCs together. Like if a Wrecking Ball rolls through him and then a Lucio also boops him, there is just a lot of CC in the game, so comboing them together at the 30% value still can move Reinhardt around. I'm not sure how I feel about this change. I was kind of hoping that they would buff the other tanks to be similar to Reinhardt's kind of pretty strong value, hard enough to get people to play tank as it is. And I think this kind of change is simply targeting the pro meta and perhaps might have adverse side effects. So I don't know, conversation for another day, but Overwatch badly needs a lot more tank and supports. I'm really hoping that Overwatch 2 brings a big injection of heroes, because I think the game badly needs it when we are in a 2-2-2 world. And I think overall would just help the balancing be a lot easier, so that when they ban 1 or 2 tanks in these hero pools, that there isn't so much one clear, obvious answer. But that's everything that we got for today's video. If you did enjoy it, please be sure to leave it a like. It really does help us out. Let us know that you're enjoying the content. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to actually get notified when our videos go live. Link to the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. We'll see you guys next time.